so this next panel discussion looks at impact investing post-COVID-19. I think yesterday we had a couple of mentions, or just the issue of impact was popping in other discussions yesterday. So I'm sure those of you who are involved in your schemes, investments, you are fully aware on the issues of impact and ESG. I think Rosemary mentioned yesterday the legal interpretation that she did for Just Share, where now funds are expected to consider or put into consideration issues of impact or environmental issues into their investment decisions. So we would want this panel to kind of explore what different options that pension schemes in Africa have when they want to invest, and how they can invest sustainably, they can invest responsibly. And we would want to look at socially responsible investing. We would like to look at impact and returns, what objectives that investment managers can put into these decisions. We'll look at the objectives, and we'll also actually look at the impact, the issue of what they are calling or terming as impact washing. You know, so I'm yet to see my participants. Okay, there's Tanya. Tanya is the CEO of Southern Africa Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Welcome, Tanya. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Great to be here.
Nice to see you, Tanya. I've got my friend there, Nicole Martins. She's the head of Africa and Middle East for the United Nations funded or supported Principles for Responsible Investing. And my other friend, Japheth. Japheth, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Japheth is the CEO of Goodson Capital Partners. They've got offices here in Kenya. They've got offices in Botswana, in South Africa. And Japheth is also a professor at Wits University. Do we have somebody else? Is that so?
I see Lindiwe is also here.
Lindiwe, I'm looking for Lindiwe.
Yes, am I still mute? Oh, okay. Yes, I'm here. Hi, hello, good morning, everyone.
Great, great. Just adjust your screen a bit, Lindiwe.
Oh.
Lindiwe is the CEO of LCM Capital. Quite experienced. She's worked in the UK, in the US, and is now based in Botswana. And our friend Rory. Rory, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Steve.
Great, great. Rory is from 274 Investment Managers, doing quite great work with impact investing. So welcome all of you. I think I will hand over to Nicole. Nicole, are you ready?
Brilliant. Yes, all good. Thank you so much. Thanks again for the invitation to be part of this discussion. Thank you to the panelists for making some time. A special thanks to Nicola, who's sitting there in Nairobi. It's a shame you can't join us in our virtual room, but we'll try not to make you feel too left out. So very good morning to everyone that's joining us here today for this discussion on impact investing post-COVID-19 as part of the annual Pensions and Retirement Summits for 2020. A big congratulations to the event organizers for managing to pull off a hybrid in-person and digital event. That's no small feat. As mentioned, my name is Nicole Martins, and I'm the head of Africa and Middle East for the United Nations Supported Principles for Responsible Investment, or just PRI. For those of you who don't know, the PRI exists to support investors in the practical implementation of the principles for responsible investment, which all revolve around the integration of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors, into investment decision-making and active ownership practices. Over the past decade, there's been a notable upswing in the number of investors that are adopting this responsible investment approach, so who are looking at ESG factors as part of their investment decisions. And the PRI's membership is now more than 3,100 signatories globally, who represent more than half of the world's total institutional investment. So this ESG integration, this idea of responsible investment, it's mainstream officially in every way. And to take that a step further, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we've seen in the discourse in investment circles is that it's been increasingly concerned with the identification of, the measurement of, the analysis of, and the communication of ESG factors as far as they materially impact on investment return, on stability, and on sustainability. So in the panel today, we're going to take a closer look at the investor experience during the pandemic, and what trends we've seen with this focus on impact. We'll also examine some of the opportunities, as Steve mentioned, that exist for impactful and financially rewarding investment as African countries enter their pandemic recovery. In the interest of time, we're not going to do sort of in-depth introductions. Steve has covered the details, and if each speaker will just remind everyone who they are before they start speaking, I think that should do it. And then I encourage you to reach out to the event organizers or directly to the speakers if you have further questions. Also, if you've got any questions during the discussion, please feel free to throw them into the chat, and we'll try and address them. What we plan to do is have each speaker answer a couple of questions relatively briefly to give us a sense of what's going on, and then we'll ideally have some time for questions and answers at the end. I think what we'll start with is just really, as I mentioned, the pandemic has highlighted areas of our socioeconomic and our environmental systems that have previously been neglected. And it showed us that we as the global community are capable of shutting down the entire world economic system in order to prioritize human health and well-being. So prioritizing there that impact issue over financial return. So what's interesting is to try and get a sense of what has been the experience of investors in this time and what priorities have arisen and how has this investment practice changed during this pandemic. Rory, maybe we can start with you and get a sense from you from 27/4's perspective. What's the experience been? What are some of the trends that you guys have picked up over the course of this tumultuous year?
Thanks, Nicole. It really has been a tumultuous year, and I know it's been said a lot of times, but it does feel like so much longer than a year. It feels like so much more has happened in this period, and I think that's true not only from an investment perspective, but also from the amount of thinking and in a lot of ways the amount of progress in thinking that's happened in investment circles, and particularly when it comes to things like application of ESG and impact types of principles. I think there's a number of things that we've noticed from the year, and perhaps just for context before I go into them. So 27/4 is a South Africa-based firm mainly investing for pension funds, foundations, and other type of institutional investors, and investing across asset classes. I've got a particular responsibility for private markets, so that's where my comments will come from. It's quite also focused on the South African scene, so that's where my comments will be focused. So I think because of our position kind of sitting between pension fund investors and the funds that we invest in, and then seeing how the underlying investments perform, we could see how that value chain was operating through this year of crisis. And so the first thing that we noticed was, there was quite a marked difference in the way that institutional investors could react to the crisis in the beginning of the year. It kind of highlighted the preparation, where there was preparation for this type of event and where there wasn't, and also the way that the decision-making frameworks work. So, where there were very rigid decision-making structures, quarterly meetings and where people had to meet in person and that sort of thing, it was quite difficult for decisions to get made and for normal sort of continuity to happen. And you had a lot of other things happening at the same time, you know, fear of retrenchments, you know, pension funds not knowing where, you know, what their liquidity needs were, and having to make decisions. So I think the one thing that it really highlighted was the kind of the need for almost in advance crisis type of planning at an institutional level. And then the second thing, you know, so post that kind of period, and once we've gotten, not that we have any kind of certainty at the moment, we don't, but perhaps after that initial period of grave uncertainty, when we saw a rebound in listed markets, and we saw a little bit more stability in investment markets as a whole, we definitely found a lot more appetite for discussions around sustainability, around investing for impact. And I think a lot of that came from kind of the fact that you could no longer escape the thinking that that investment markets were somehow separate from real lived experiences of people in countries. And you know, and a particular area where we focus our impact efforts is around jobs. And that was, you know, something that came into huge focus because of South Africa's jobs crisis, and many countries faced similar things. So I mean, we've seen a lot of interest in discussing, you know, in shifting investment portfolios and looking at more investing in what termed, I guess, the real economy versus such a heavy skew towards only you know, a small subsegment of the market which sits in the listed space. So that's been a big shift. And then we've been asked to do quite a lot of work around preparing our clients for understanding impact and ESG investing better. As a last comment, I would say that there's been such a big focus on cooperation this year. We've seen that at every level, kind of in unprecedented terms. You know, we've heard it from healthcare workers about how they've shared information around the world in record time and got things done in record time. But it's also happened in a lot of a lot of parts of the investment markets, and that's been really encouraging. So I think we'll probably look back on this year and say it was a horrible year, but a lot of acceleration and progress happened.
Thanks, Rory. I think that's really, I mean, some of the key trends there, I think sum it up nicely. It's really this increasing focus on real world impact. And I think a growing understanding of the interconnected nature of ESG issues and financial issues. You know, these things are not operating in bubbles. And then, like you say, there's growing awareness of the need to collaborate in order to achieve the objectives we've set for these broader sort of socioeconomic and environmental objectives for those targets. Linda, is that sort of reflective of the experience that you guys have had this year as well?
Yes, I'd say I would agree with what Rory has just discussed. In Botswana, the trend now for institutional investors is on impact investing, which was usually not the case. So we have seen a keen interest in infrastructure asset class, whereas before institutional investors were more risk averse to consider that asset class. But because we've seen many listed stocks withhold dividends for cash preservation, it means that they're looking for ways to gain a high return. So hence the need to look into sustainable investing. And the success of the KwaZulu Bridge, which will connect 4 countries in the southern region, will also help increase the net flow into infrastructure asset class. The bridge is due to be opened and is due to be launched in January 2021. So, we anticipate to see more intra-African trade in the region, and more goods and services, like, export market will definitely increase. So there's more optimism in infrastructure asset class. And lastly, not lastly, I mean, when we talk about the infrastructure as a class, is more growing interest on agriculture. You know, during the epicenter of the pandemic, when Botswana went into lockdown in March, became quite apparent that we were so codependent on regional suppliers for food, primarily in South Africa, for us to source most of our produce. So this has highlighted the need to invest in agro-processing for us to boost our local production. So I anticipate that more institutional investors in the medium to long term will be looking into the agri space for investments. And as you know, like right now, we are not in Kenya. We have zoomed in, so it's quite clear to see how technology has played a pivotal role in business continuity and also helping SMEs to thrive and survive during this unprecedented times. So I believe that in the medium or long term, institutional investors will look for, especially the private investors, will look for emerging and growth tech companies, especially those ones that will be offering cloud solutions, because technology is playing a very critical role in how we build sustainable businesses going forward. And as more companies going on to the digitalization space. There was one other point I've mentioned: food security and healthcare investment. We've seen a lot of companies, accelerate the digital transformation, but e-health is yet to, like the gain on e-health is yet to be realized. As more companies, as we try and curb person-to-person contact, that means that when you go to the clinic, like public clinic, you expect them to be integrating some form of technology. But, as of yet, I believe they still paper trail, a lot of paper. So more investment towards increasing or enhancing the health service will be, like investors will be keen to look to work on that. So in conclusion, ESG as an afterthought, I believe that is no longer the case. More investment or the latest strategy is towards sustainable integration, which a lot of DFIs were the pioneers, they've done that, but the strategies that they were using was more negative screening more than sustainable screening. They were not investing in sin stocks like your tobaccos, but Botswana is still holding on to 212 tons or billion tons of coal, which means that fossil fuel will be, I mean, a lot of investment in fossils will still be there. There'll be other investors interested in leveraging of coal, but in a more sustainable way. So, the integration of sustainable investing will still be considered a priority, whereas before it wasn't. And it will be, since you are from the UNPRI, it will be good to mention that locally, we already have 4 pension funds that are listed or signatories to the UNPRI, and my fund, or the fund that is under LCM Capital, will also be one of the signatories in the near future.
Well, thanks, Cindy. I'm very happy to hear that. I think that's great. Obviously, you can be a responsible investor without signing up to the PRI. but it does help you because we obviously will provide sort of that hands-on guidance. But it's interesting, you know, some of these opportunities, and I think that's what's important to understand as well, is that, you know, I think to date, the focus on ESG integration has been as a risk mitigant. It's been identify what are the most impactful risks that, to your portfolio that are potentially non-financial but could have financial implication later. And that's really, that thinking has evolved into an opportunity lens. It's thinking not just how do I mitigate these risks, but how do I maximize the value that I can create, both financially and other, you know, in terms of that impact. And you mentioned a number of the opportunities that exist in the market around sort of alternatives. I think large-scale infrastructure projects definitely make sense. It's a way to generate long-term financial return and have a significant socioeconomic impact, which is great. Tanya, let's come to you next. I know that you've recently engaged with your members on this issue. So if we can understand that there's definitely a risk mitigant aspect, Lindiwe has talked about some of the opportunity that exists. I mean, from the experience of your members, are people taking advantage of this? Are they implementing this kind of strategy going forward?
Thank you, Nicole. So what we're seeing is that when we engage with our members, at a minimum, 98% of them consider ESG as part of the investment decision. I think the important role that the development finance institutions played on the continent sort of earmarked ESG as part of investment practices on the continent. And when you speak to international experts, they do say that from an ESG perspective, the African continent and the investors on the African continent are far more advanced in their practices and the methodologies that they use than their developed market counterparts, which is good news for us. But I think what we're seeing now is a movement towards more impact investing. And although 98% of our members at a minimum look at ESG, only 50% at this stage have an intent or an impact investing mandate within their fund strategy. But I do think we're going to see more of this, not only in the private equity and the venture capital space, but also in aspects such as listed instruments, such as green bonds, etc. So there's definitely a movement towards more impact investing. And I think what the alternative asset class can offer is access to industries that you might not find on a listed equities, as an example. As Lindiwe said, there's a lot of investment into technology and infrastructure. I think what the crisis has shown us is the vulnerabilities, and it's exposed the inequalities and the vulnerabilities within our various economies. And without the necessarily technology infrastructure, there's no online school, there's no events like these where we can connect different countries, different speakers in different continents all at the same time. Remote working is now a reality in terms of the fact that so many people had to work from home. So that technology infrastructure is crucial and key to be able to invest in the future of countries. So impact investing is not only about water or agriculture. It can come in many forms and various sizes. And we've seen with the investment mandates of our members, they invest in various industries across the spectrum. I think what's important to note is that there needs to be alignment between the members of a pension fund, the trustees, the consultants and the advisors, and ultimately where the investment is going if you are going to invest with an impact lens. An example of where there was key alignment in South Africa is the transport sector pension fund, where they invested in truck stops, which not only improved the quality of the lives of their members and safety protocols, but it opened up, it really had a multiplier effect, and it opened up retail shops, mechanics. It really opened up this whole ecosystem that wasn't there before. And not only did they improve the lives of their members now, but they also improved the lives of their members in the future. So it's about what are you investing now, but also how is that going to impact the lives of your members in the future, and what are they retiring into? And I think that's where some of the alternative asset classes can give access to industries and projects that won't necessarily be in the mainstream market.
things, Tanya, and I do think, I mean, from the conversations we've, as the PRI, have been having with our signatories and with asset owners, there is growing appetite for alternatives as a way to achieve that impact and financial return. So maybe it's a good time then to turn to Nicola and say, you know, as someone who's working with the listed markets in those public markets, I mean, what do you see as the role of the exchange in this sort of growing trend towards more impactful investment, toward understanding not just which ESG factors affect your investment, but what is the effect of your investment on the broader market, and this idea that it's easier or more straightforward to achieve that in the alternatives market? Where do you see the exchange playing a role in maintaining relevance, I guess, when it comes to impact investing?
Thanks, Nicole. I think just to quickly echo, and I'm not going to look at the screen, so I'm going to rather look in front of me so I can talk to the audience, but I think then it will actually appear like I'm talking to you. So I think just to echo Tanya's points and just to talk about some of the stats that the CFA Institute recently published, that about only 70%, and that's quite a high number, of international investors consider ESG in their approach. But that just talks to the South African and the African context. Is actually, we're at a higher percentage where we get to closer to 80 to 90%. So to me, I think we really are leaders in this space, and certainly can be proud of that. And I'm just thinking of yesterday's conversation when we specifically had the panel talking about universal social pension. And we spoke about things like having a broader and wider savings priorities, which includes housing, schooling, as well as healthcare. And for me, this talks to all the points and examples that Rory, etc., have already raised in terms of what impact investing is focusing on. So for me, these two things are integrally linked. And I think just taking a step back, we've been talking about responsible investing, sustainability, ESG, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which was previously the Millennium Development Goals, and all of these like an alphabet soup of terminology, and now talking about impact investing. But all of that really boils down to the triple bottom line, not just focusing on your profit, but also focusing on people and planet. And what I'm hearing a lot of CEOs are now also talking about, replacing the terminology of profit, is focusing on purpose. So they're saying, I much rather want an organization that's clear about my purpose, the impact I'm going to make on the environment, and then focus on my people as well as the planet. And then profit will follow. So for me, that's to bring in the relevance of impact investing and how that links to the exchange and the listed environment. This is where we're seeing corporates are changing the narrative. And so I certainly agree that one wouldn't be looking at negative screening. One would be looking at the organizations that have really considered sustainability in their thinking and in their approach. And so for me, that's talking to the key points that I've just mentioned, focusing on people, planet, and purpose, and all of that will end up delivering profits. So if I take a step back, I mean, the JSE's journey has been really rich. We entered this space when the Earth Summit was hosted in Johannesburg 18 years ago already. We already started encouraging listed companies to consider and having an integrated approach, not just focusing on maximizing the shareholder wealth, but looking at their broader stakeholder base and how do they impact the societies around them, how do they impact the environment, etc. So I mean, our journey really started 18 years ago, and then officially 10 years ago, we hard-coded some of those elements in our listing requirements, supporting the King Code. So we have a seat at the King Committee, and certainly very important to talk about integrated reporting and how impact investing and being a sustainable business is really critical. And then I think just talking practically some of the things we've done, listed the responsible we've got the social responsible investment indices available. We were the first exchange in the world to launch those already 16 years ago. We've got futures contracts listed on those underlying products. We've launched the green bond segment, and we've got green bonds listed. And then we've got an ESG data platform. But the most recent thing, which talks specifically to impact investing, is this year we've launched our sustainability segment, which is really looking for social impact investments and sustainability bonds. And so we've just been listing and providing these platforms because investors have been engaging us and saying we need to provide different opportunities to our clients. In that regard, we're also looking at a private markets initiative. We are looking at expanding our offerings. So we as a listed exchange will obviously always have our listed offering, and we'll always engage with our listed companies in terms of their sustainability practices. But we also acknowledge, and myself as the chairman of the JSE Pension Fund, acknowledge that we need to diversify our investments. We can't just look at listed investments. We also have to look at private markets. So we are also looking at a private markets platform and those types of solutions. So I think just to end off, reflecting on the World Economic Forum and their top risks for 2020, it's the first time in the history of the World Economic Forum report that all 5 of their top risks relating to impact was related to the environment. So it was all climate risks. And so I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that specifically Africa, in the context of the country and the continents that we live in, or the continents and the countries that we live in, will be so severely impacted by climate change. And what are we actively doing through our pension funds to make sure that there's sufficient investment to turn that narrative around? And I think just in closing, the last report that was issued after the COVID pandemic had hit us, it was interesting to see the World Economic Forum, the top 5 risks was all economic. So for me now talks to the structural gaps in our system. And I think we spoke about some of those things yesterday. But for me, these are integrally linked. Economic challenges should always be considered with the environment. And I think let me leave it at that. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicola. I think, it's so good to hear, the role of an exchange is as an interlocutor in the market, and then also as a regulator. It's important to hear and good to hear that you send those signals to the market about what is important, what do we consider pertinent to sustainability, to the stability of the market, and require that as part of our listing requirements and the disclosures that we're asking for. And this investigation of a private markets model is very exciting. I think that, to go to you, Japheth, I mean, if I'm sitting in the audience now, either, virtually, or I'm sitting in this room in Nairobi and I represent a pension fund, I mean, where do I go with all this information? So I've heard that it's really important to integrate ESG, to consider impact. I've heard about some of the potential sectors where this is growing in traction. I've heard that I can maybe look at alternatives, or I can look at listed markets. I mean, if you were going to give someone in that audience advice, if I'm going back to speak to my consultants or my managers tomorrow, what are some of the questions I need to ask, or the priorities that I should be thinking of putting in place?
Okay, I think thank you so much, Nicole. I think your question needs to sort of have one context for it to be fairly dealt with. 2, before we delve into what sort of sectors, what sort of instruments, and what sort of challenges you might have, I think the best is to sort of give a bit of a context in that. What we've seen is various, sort of reports that cover what's going on across the globe, especially post-pandemic. And the issue has been what happens to the rural communities, which are roughly 400 million people, because there's dire strains from everything: no access to education, no access to electricity, sanitization, and of course the internet, so they don't have luxuries like what we have already. But what we've seen is, on our part, essentially, we've prioritized a couple of things in terms of what we think should be a change in our own perceptions. And one of them has been, how do we work on top 4 sort of achievable, sort of goals for us to be able to have portfolios that make sense? And one has been under the SDGs, has been sustainable cities and communities, has been sustainable development, gender equality, zero hunger. But it's just to be able to make sure that we have a focus in terms of what sectors do we go for, because the top 5 for us, it's financial inclusion, food security, clean energy, education, and housing. Now, the key issue is someone who has money and they basically want to invest, they will always have a question around what sort of instruments do we go for. So what we've seen is private debt has more sort of acceptability from the funding community slightly higher than private equity. And of course, the third has been equity-linked sort of instruments. The challenges have always been, what else do you provide in that sort of environment? You can provide financial support, but how do you provide additional non-financial support? And in terms of co-investing, how do you introduce those portfolio companies to other investors so that you're able to meet the challenge of the total amount required? Now, under these circumstances, it's become a reality that doing due diligence can be like what we used to do before. So essentially that has, sort of picked up as one of the key areas. But the good part is, I think it was annual impact investor report that was released recently, I think 2 months ago. Pre-COVID, impact assets were basically 3%. From the respondents, they said it will go up to 18% post-pandemic. I mean, that's a very huge jump. But then traditionally, the challenge has been we have profit and non-profit managers, which account for around 51%, then foundations around 11%, family offices around 9%. But 47 of them are American. And then UK 11%, then India 6%, I think Netherlands sits at 5%. So what does that mean for us as Africa? Now, the advantage is Africa has, sort of been catapulted to where it's one of the regions that there's a lot of interest at the moment. One, just because it's coming off a low base, but of course there's huge need for impact in sub-Saharan Africa. So most of them basically looked at sub-Saharan Africa on that standpoint. But the key issue is how do we manage to handle the question of instruments, sectors, and the challenges highlighted. And it purely boils down to what you guys are doing, Nicole, in terms of being able to say, we've vetted this ones and we're able to vouch for them as asset managers. What JSC is doing in terms of creating instruments that are basically investable, and it's easy for you to be able to have a see-through process. So essentially, that's what I think. Now, the challenge in Africa will always remain, how do we leapfrog ourselves? So in conclusion, I think it was this morning, I was reading a Boston consulting group, service delivery, I think it's Service Factory report that they released this morning. But they were saying the future is going to be dispersed, minimalist workforces of high-skilled specialists collaborating with digital technologies and tools. So exactly like what we're doing now. So we should also look at opportunities that will be able to create jobs sustainably and be able to allow specialists to work in different areas and manage to do skills transfers and create jobs like what Rory is doing under the Jobs Fund as well. So essentially, that's what I'll say in conclusion.
Thank you, Jos. I think that's a great summary, this understanding that if you are in that asset owner position, it's really important to have a very clear vision, a set of values that's what's important to you, what is your investment approach, what do you want to focus on, so that you can give clear instruction, and then wherever possible, try to protect yourself against that greenwashing angle. So things like a PRI signatory status and asking for those assessment reports, asking what is your approach to this? Can you give me an example of where you've identified a risk and then engage with that company on it, and what was the outcome of that? I think that's really important because as we know, the focus is moving towards the outcomes, the real world impact. So it's really not, oh, sorry, I just saw someone come in the chat. I thought it was a question. Yeah, so it's really just focusing on the so what of every decision. So it's not good enough anymore for your consultants or your managers to report back to you and say, oh, we sent 400 letters out to every company in our portfolio. So what happened? And then what? And then did you engage? Or, oh yes, we asked everyone for their carbon data and their water data. Okay, and then what did you do with this data? Did you use it to inform your strategy? It needs to be sort of pushing to that next level. And I think that's really important. And understanding that there are all these different products out there that are now available, making sure that you still interrogate them, I think one of the things we've seen as the PRI is that people tend to make the mistake of thinking that because an investment is green or sustainable, it doesn't have to be subject to the same scrutiny in terms of your due diligence process. It absolutely still needs to make sense as a financial investment. Just because it's impactful doesn't mean it makes financial sense. Just because it's financially rewarding doesn't mean it can't be impactful. So I think it's important to understand all of those things. But I know that we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to get to some of the audience questions. So I'll quickly do my thank you now just to all the panelists for your views. It's been really great to get these different perspectives. There's a great question in the Q&A box at the moment asking what the impact has been of the pandemic on retirement funds and investments, especially for the young retirees who are drawing from living annuities, and what are some of the steps that we need to be taking as the beneficiaries and or authorities to sort of counter these. Lindiwe, I don't know if you want to have a stab at that in your experience. I mean, have retirement funds been suffering? Have beneficiaries been hard hit by the pandemic?
Well, in Botswana's context, because that's where my main focus will be, the biggest institutional investor or the biggest pension fund has reported double digits profits amid COVID-19. So I mean, that question, I mean, even the second one has also reported double-digit returns in 2020. Could be because, you know, for Botswana, the allocation is that 30% is invested locally and 70% is offshore. So maybe from a diversification perspective, they can still manage to hedge against fluctuations. So the return for the pensioners has been great this year, but you know, maybe 2020, since now the DCI Domestic Company Index has shared its market capitalization by 8.31% year to date. That could not be the case in the short term. So they could see a dwindling in the return. But for now, what the pension funds reported was positive for the beneficiaries, for the members, despite COVID-19.
Well, that's good news, I guess. I think we'll probably find that it's a mixed bag across markets, which is the case with most investment stories. It all depends on, you know, I'm an economist and we always say, oh, we can absolutely predict how things will go if all our assumptions hold, but the assumptions never hold. And I think that's the beauty of it. Steve, I don't know if you want to see if there are any questions in the room, maybe.
Yeah, I will be taking a few questions. Just as part of what we wanted this panel to explore, I think Rory or maybe Tanya and Nicola can take this. The biggest concern here that we've had from the industry when it comes to impact has been the issue of measurement. Whatever organizations are investing in can be measured. And if there is purpose from the word go when they go into these investments. How have you been your experience, Rory, especially when it comes to measuring impact? And what are some of the maybe experiences of your pension funds? Which impact sectors have they gone to? I think Lindiwe mentioned some of the core sectors that COVID has exposed. So with this topic, we really wanted to get what sectors are pension funds gone into, what impact have they created in those markets, and how are they able to measure this kind of impact? Can you be able to elaborate that? Any of you can take up after all.
Thanks, Steve. Happy to pick that up. So as I understood the question, it's around how do pension funds actually measure impact and what particular sectors have they been looking to gain impact in. I think probably the answer to both of those questions starts in objective setting. It starts with an outlook. and that varies by investor, varies by pension fund, depending on which country they're in, what their membership base looks like, what the particular concerns are of the membership base, and then how that gets reflected into a board of trustees and how they might set their general investment objectives. Depending if they're DB or DC funds as well, it might, their funding levels, the financial position of the fund itself might also give more flexibility or less flexibility around, their ability to achieve some of these other objectives. We heard from Nicola earlier, around the alphabet soup of all the different standards and sets of frameworks and things to apply. So I guess it's the job of people working with pension funds to help them to distill that into something that's practical and a bit more workable. I think if you try to apply the SDGs, you apply the International Labour Organization standards, the empowerment of women, all the environmental standards, the IFC standards, the impact measurement standards, you can get quite bogged down. So that's why I say it starts with objectives. If you can, as a board of trustees on a pension fund, if you can just set a couple of things, a few things that you want to start with that you think are the most important impact type of objectives that you would have, then you can start to set goals around those things, and work out if there is a transition needed in your portfolio, and the kinds of things that's going to entail. So some trustees might say they don't want to invest in anything that's going to harm the environment, and they might want to pull back from some investments. Others might decide, look, we're large pension funds, it's not realistic for us not to invest in certain things, and we need to make sure that we're voting appropriately and we're intervening with companies to make necessary decisions. From where our focus more lies is in the unlisted side, and maybe that things like job creation or economic transformation are important, and then the board of trustees needs to understand how to do that. And there's lots and lots of reference material to help with measurement, but it all comes down to being intentional. And specialists in the space will tell you about setting baselines and kind of setting out objectives and how you plan to get to a point over a period of time. And you have to do that if you really want to tell if you're succeeding or failing, if you're ahead or behind. You need to kind of work out what that path looks like. On the sector side, I think there's been a massive focus on renewable energy, and it's clear why that's the case. I think there has been some neglect in the rest of infrastructure and the impact that the rest of infrastructure, other types of infrastructural investments can have. Yeah, you can almost, everything, I think every kind of investment has a certain impact type of lens that can be applied to it. Things can either be done better, or, you can really understand the impact that a particular investment has on communities or the environment or energy production or whatever the particular lens is. So it's it's a very important area, and it's one that takes a while for institutional investors to get comfortable with, and often takes a series of interventions.
Okay, that's great. Nicola, you want to take it?
Sure. Well, maybe I can just give a practical example from us as the JSE Pension Fund. So as a trustee, we've set ourselves some clear objectives. So we specifically linked it to the National Development Plan in South Africa, and we linked it to the Sustainable Development Goals. We specifically looked at our objectives, which is employment and ensuring inclusive growth. So we've centered our impact investing allocation around addressing the three of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is number 1, no poverty, number 8, decent work and economic growth, and number 10, reduced inequalities. So we're specifically looking for impact investment opportunities in the job preservation space, job growth, and job access and inclusivity. So I think the point is just that each fund has to decide, and this links into our strategic objective as an exchange as well in terms of inclusive growth. So I think that has informed really our decision here.
And so practically, we've gone for the Gen X Credit Opportunities Fund, which is really addresses those three goals, and we then get reporting back on the performance through our service provider, Sanlam. And we've got a specific allocation then to impact investing, and we would review that. That fund specifically has a 10-year track record. It's consistently met its targets and actually has outperformed in terms of the specific objectives. So I think just giving a practical example, and then as Japheth has mentioned, we've really seen allocation to impact investing has more than doubled in the last 5 years. So I think really all pension fund trustees, including myself and others that are engaged with in the industry, are really looking at our approaches in the fund. We've always considered ESG. We've looked at sustainability. We've wanted to make sure we consider it across the portfolio, but we're now carving out a specific allocation to impact funds.
Thank you. I'll go back to Lindiwe. Lindiwe, from your experience in Botswana, I think you mentioned how COVID has exposed us in terms of some of the sectors that are maybe underfunded. Have you had any experiences either in the continent or just in Botswana where there's been a focus on a gender lens kind of investing, where you have a focus on women or funding, investing in sectors that maybe promote women or improve lifestyles of women across the continent? Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I was working on the mute button. Yes, I would say that there has been a gender focused funds emerging in the past year or so. So, excuse me just for a minute, sorry.
Okay, we can take you out a bit, then I go to Japheth. Just take out Lindiwe for a second. Japheth, one of the key concerns of impact investing has been the issue of returns. When investors go into this kind of, Lindiwe, we're gonna come back to you. We're gonna come back to you.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, sorry. Business continuity. Working from when you're working from home, my son, the school is out. So he has forgotten that I'm still in the office.
First.
Hello?
Okay, Lindiwe, we'll come back to you in a second. Let Japheth take this one first.
All right.
Not a problem. We fully understand this. Japheth, the issue of returns on impact. Are investors getting the right returns when they go into these impact investing kind of ventures? What is your take?
I'll tell you about our experience in the continent. So essentially, the biggest problem has been the fact that investors, regardless whether they're going to sort of do good or they're going to sort of across asset classes, the issue for them has been returns. Now, what we've seen is that in Africa, in fact, most of the fund of funds that are looking at impact are looking at roughly 18% IRRs. We've looked at South Africa where it's, and Rory can basically sort of chip in here, but we've had conversations in the region of 25% IRRs in rand terms. So essentially that has been a challenge if you're a fund, because the biggest problem is you're trying to do good, but for opportunities within impact for you to manage at those sort of hurdle levels, it's not as easy. But investors are doing good and they're also getting decent returns. So essentially we need to sort of find a balance in terms of how do we manage to co-invest sustainably? How do we manage to also blend with non-financial support in some of these opportunities? Because essentially you lose out money if you don't follow through on some of these investment processes, especially where you've done your objective settings from the beginning and you need to have certain parameters in check. So all in all, in conclusion, it's not like a wasted sort of effort to invest in impact. The thing is the balance between doing good and the returns thresholds.
Okay, can I go back to Lindiwe? Lindiwe, your thoughts on gender-focused investing?
Yes, as I was saying, apologies about that. I had to ask my son to tone it down a little bit.
Not a problem, not a problem.
Yes, so as I was saying, in the last 5 years, there has been a increase in women focused funds. The pioneers of women focused funds have been, well, from an inclusion perspective, has been the DFIs. They have, from a micro level, given private debt to women-owned businesses, and also from a private equity perspective. I'm one of the few founders or few female-owned impact investing funds focused also on women. So the priority to invest in women is very high because, you know, as we all know, in terms of investment towards women, the representation, I mean, funding towards women owned businesses is quite low. So if we have more females in private equity, that increases the chances of females to be financed, which is usually the biggest risk for women scaling their businesses. So my fund, which is Theo Impact Fund, is also targeted towards females, but currently we are capital raising for the fund. So more women will be included. And from a general perspective, we are starting to see gender inclusion in boards, whereas before, you know, some of the companies, where they're listed, they would have 100% board members as male. So now we are starting to see an infusion of females at the board level, which is good, because when we have more female representation at board, that means that they will advocate for more females to join. And the more they advocate, that means funding will be extended towards females. So the gender topic is being you know, discussed, and action is being done on that front. So yeah, I would say that in conclusion, gender inclusion is paramount where we are going to build sustainable businesses. And from a cognitive diversity perspective, we need to hear the female side, so that we can build very robust and successful businesses. We need to include females.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to go back to actually Nicole. The issue of kind of stakeholder activism. Are pension funds factoring in that? I think maybe Nicola can also comment on that, because there's increased risk of you know, stakeholder activism across the continent. I think there's been elements of that in South Africa. What is your comment, Nicole, on that?
Well, mine would be that you, thanks Steve, you ignore your stakeholders at your own peril. I think it's really important to understand that people have got increasingly strong views about these things, about how their money is managed, about where you're investing the money that they work to earn. If you're investing it in companies that they wouldn't buy from, or if you are investing it in places where they feel it's contrary to their own value system, you'll very shortly find out that they don't want to give you their money anymore. And I think we see that not just with shareholder activism at the AGMs, with the tabling of climate resolutions and protests outside of investment banks across the world at the moment. So I think my comment is just, you ignore that at your peril, and it's really important to understand the market demand. I mean, it's core to your business, right? You're supposed to provide a service that people want to pay for. And if you're not going to listen to them, you're not going to be in business for long.
Thank you very much. For now, I'll take a few questions, just quickly, if we have any question in the floor. Okay, we'll take some questions. Just be brief.
Okay, thank you, presenters. I have two questions. The first one is to understand from African perspective, the relationship between conventional investment and SRI. Because what will push people to go for the SRI is the return from the shareholder perspective. Then the second question, probably more specifically for UNDP, is to understand if standardization is possible from a regulatory perspective, so that this will push more people, more investors and companies to follow more basis for SRIs. Thank you.
Was that one for me?
Nicole, I don't know if you wanted to go first.
Oh, no, I might just because I have to jump off in a minute, but I'd say that standardization, on the standardization issue, there are great efforts underway in terms of developing frameworks for measurement and communication of ESG data. At the moment, though, the bulk of the market are using the GRI frameworks in that respect. There's also been a merger between the Integrated Reporting Council and SASB in the States to set sort of standards for that. In terms of the policy and regulation, that's definitely moving in the same direction. Most markets are starting to institute the similar combination of disclosure requirements, taxonomies, and overarching net zero targets. So the standardization movement is happening, but it is taking a bit of time. As you can imagine, it's quite complicated. And it will, at the moment, one of the big problems is that different investors are developing bespoke tools for measuring and communicating data, and that is going to be a problem to try and standardize, but it is happening. And if you're an asset owner, you can push for that, right? You can ask all of your managers to use the same framework. It doesn't have to be one you made, but it can be one that you take and you just endorse that to help everybody be on the same page. That might help with that one. And then the difference between the impact and the socially responsible investment. It's really about intentionality, as Rory was saying. So if your intention is simply to maximize long-term returns, and to do that, you're integrating ESG factors, that's more responsible investment. If your intention is to generate a specific social, environmental, or socioeconomic impact, you're an impact investor. So it's really about how are you approaching it. So are you focusing on financial return, but you understand you need to take these other things into account, then it's a responsible investment. If you are intending to generate impact, then you're an impact investor. I hope that is helpful. I'm really sorry, I do have to jump off to another webinar now, but I appreciate the invitation to be here. Thank you again to the organizers, and thank you very much to all the speakers for their insights. I could always chat to you guys for hours. Please don't think I'm rude, but I've got to jump to my next session. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you. You can go.
Sure, thank you. I think just to add one point to Lindiwe's point, so we also hard-coded in the JSE listing requirements that the listed companies have to meet a specific target of female directors on their board. And I think a lot of exchanges are moving in that direction as well. And then the question from the audience, I think specifically talking about socially responsible investing and how that differs, I think Nicole answered it quite well, but I think the only other perspective I'd add is that the way we've looked at it as an exchange is that we don't have exclusionary indices. We say anyone can be part of the socially responsible investment index if you have been approaching your company objectives in a sustainable way. So you've considered environment, your impact on the environment, you've considered society, you've considered governance. And so we've actually seen some of our mining companies who have a very big impact on the environment have actually had very high ESG scores because they've made sure that they've set up their structures in a way that they give back to the societies around them, etc. So so one wouldn't necessarily think that those are the ones that are up there. So I think that the key thing for me is we want corporates to rethink the way and the approach that they take. So it's not about saying you can't produce tobacco, etc. I suppose some investors might be different. Lindy Wes mentioned that some investors might have a specific exclusionary approach. But what we've seen is that most investors really just want to see the companies that are operating in your environment are doing that in the most sustainable way that they can.
Do we have another question? Any question? Okay. Just introduce yourself.
Morning, my name's Monica from NWealth Kenya. So I wanted to find out what are the core risks or setback of the impact investing, especially for the pension funds.
Did you get the question? Panelists? Can they hear me?
If I think the question was, what are some of the setbacks or challenges for pension funds investing into impact investing?
Yes.
I'll start and then the others can chime in. I think one of the things about impact investing is that when you invest in impact investing, currently some of the projects and the fund managers that do impact investing that give you access to this, they're all long-term investors. So you need to look at your liquidity requirements as a pension fund. And when you are going to invest in impact investing, look at the percentage that you can allocate to impact investing, knowing that it is a long-term game and how it will affect your liquidity requirements that you need, as well as your performance requirements that you want. From a performance perspective, you, as Jafford and Rory said, there's a need to have a financial return, but then you should also know exactly when you're going to invest, what else are you going to measure and what are you going to link it into. I think one of the biggest challenges in impact investing, and the panel has alluded to it, is all the models and the different aspects that are out there. Harmonization is one of the biggest challenges, but as a pension fund, if you are going to invest, know exactly why you're investing, how you're going to monitor and evaluate it, and what is it going to do in terms of your liquidity requirements going forward.
Okay, do we have any other takers from the panel? Okay, any other question? Can I take another question? Okay, then with that, I think we will close. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you for making time, Nicola, for making the journey to Kenya. Tanya, thank you for joining us, and Japheth and Rory and Lindy. Thank you very much. Can we appreciate them? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.